Witam bardzo serdecznie. To jest kolejny odcinek audycji z cyklu BezCelibatu Plus, czyli audycji, w której zapraszamy specjalnych gości, z którymi rozmawiamy na, jak zwykle zawsze, tematy ciekawe, interesujące, czasem kontrowersyjne, ale chcemy uczyć się albo próbować spojrzeć na tematy, o których będziemy rozmawiali z innej perspektywy. Ja nazywam się Robert Miksa, a dzisiaj mamy szczególnego gościa, Aleksander Fink. Aleksander, niestety z powodu różnic językowych będziemy mówili po angielsku, ale mam nadzieję, że później uda się podłożyć polską wersję językową i wszystko będzie dobrze. Alexander, tell us something about yourself. What's your education? What do you do? What are your passions?
Dziękuję for the invitation. Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here in Gdansk with you, Robert. And yeah, I have studied physics in the universities of Bayreuth in Bavaria, Germany, and St. Andrews in Scotland. And I've done a PhD in biophysics, doing NMR measurements in the University of Regensburg.
Biophysics. That sounds exciting.
Yeah, it's not that we are recyclable physicists, like you can recycle us, the biological physicists.
Okay.
No, we are physicists who use physical methods in order to analyze biological questions. For example, the structure of proteins and so on. That's what I worked in during my PhD.
You still work as a physicist?
Not anymore. I'm now the director of the Institut for Faith and Science.
Faith and science.
Faith and science, yeah. And not faith or science, but faith and science.
And science. So you are able to connect these two?
Actually, yeah, that's my big passion. And actually, when I studied physics, I was about the only Christian around, but I had very good conversations with my colleagues and with my friends. Most of them would not believe in God, but yeah, we had good conversations, and I don't know where they went up later.
That's interesting. Okay, a time ago, I watched a movie, More Than My Brain. And that's a movie that inspired me very much. And that's a movie produced by the Institut you work for, right?
Yes. I was in charge of producing that and creating the concept of the movie, yeah.
And I thought that it might be a great subject to talk about. What are human beings? Are we more than our brain? And that's the whole movie is about it. Let me say something in Polish to our audience.
Of course.
Mamy ten film tutaj. On jest niestety w wersji tylko niemieckiej albo angielskiej, ale ten film można zdobyć dzisiaj pod koniec tej audycji. Zadamy pytanie, na które trzeba będzie odpowiedzieć. Osoba, która jako pierwsza odpowie na to pytanie, oczywiście odpowie poprawnie, otrzyma od nas ten film. Oczywiście tam musimy się dogadać, gdzie go wysłać, albo w jaki sposób można go odebrać. Więc słuchajcie uważnie, bo rozmowa będzie naprawdę ciekawa.
It's also available on Vimeo, by the way, if people want to download it on Vimeo. Do you know Vimeo?
Yes.
Vimeo? Yeah.
Tak. Vimeo is a server where you can download
and stream.
Movies.
Yeah.
Okay. So I would like to talk about this movie because it's inspired me really and make me think. So I have lots of questions about it. But let's start from the beginning. What inspired you to create this movie? Was it your personal needs?
It was my personal interest because brain research, neuroscience really had a big start in the 2000s. There was a big manifesto in Germany where quite a few neuroscientists said within only 10 years we will be able to read the thoughts of people just by analyzing the brain. And so, But 10 years later, there was no progress in that. And so we thought, we need to talk about that. We need to think about that. Why is it that there was this huge promise and they didn't succeed? So what is a human being and why is science not able to read our thoughts? What are we as human beings? Are we just biological machines or are we more than that? That's why where the main name came from, More Than My Brain.
Okay, so it means that even if you can scan the brain or you can scan the waves that it produces, electromagnetic or whatever it is, you still cannot recognize what the person is thinking about, right?
Yes, we can only measure activities in the brain, either via EEG, we can measure the electrical currents, electrical potentials, chemical potentials of the neurons. The neurons are firing when a certain threshold is crossed, exceeded in the neurons. They will fire, and so we can measure that. Or with magnetic resonance imaging, we can measure the relaxation rates of nuclei, and that changes when there is oxygen present. And oxygen means that energy is consumed, because oxygen leads to helps to oxidize and release energy and so on. So when oxygen is present, we can measure that with magnetic resonance imaging. That indicates which areas of the brain are especially active.
Okay. So do I understand properly that we can see if the brain is active, but not what is the person thinking about?
Yeah, we only see where the brain is more active than normal, because that's another important point. The brain is always active. When you are asleep or when you are awake, when you do sports, when you do calculations and maths, the brain is always active in every part of the brain. It never shuts down somewhere, but it's always active.
Okay, but I have a question. How much of our brain is active? Is it the whole brain that is working all the time, or it's only part of the brain? Some people say we use only, let's say, I don't know, 10%, 5%, 20% of our brain. How is it?
I've heard that statement too, but actually, what does it mean to use only 10% of our brain or something like that? We don't know that, because we don't know the capacity of our brain, the storage capacity. We just don't know that. And as I said, physically, measuring the electrical currents, always all of the brain is active. But doing certain activities means that some parts of the brain become more active. It never shuts down, because you have metabolism all the time in all areas of the brain. So always the whole brain, 100% of the brain are active. When it shuts down, that would mean that your body dies. And so we can be happy that the brain is always active. And this proverb, which says you only use 20% or 80% of your brain, I think that's just populism or popularization.
And then the next sentence is, we will tell you how to use the whole brain, and you will be genius.
I think there is truth in it that often we do not understand how well and how much more we could do with our brain. For example, learning by heart. Ancient cultures, they could learn by heart all of the Bible, for example. If you think about Jewish rabbi, even today they do it. So there is a lot of capacity that we don't use because we don't learn by heart anymore. But we could train our brains to do that. But machines now have helped us not to do that anymore, because we think, why should I learn something that I couldn't look up on the computer? But in general, we could make much more of the capacity of our brain, but we cannot say we use so many % of our brain, because we can even increase the capacity of our brain, because while the number of neurons in our brain seems to be about constant during the life, the number of connections can always be increased during our life if we exercise.
Here I have a question. If we know quite a lot about the brain, not everything obviously, but we know quite a lot. And when you look at brain of different people, we see differences, right?
Even among twins, we see different brains. And the reason is, when you are born, you have already about 86 billion neurons. But they are not yet connected, or only very scarcely connected. But especially during the first 3 years and until the end of your life, actually, these neurons are connected via so-called axons. And one neuron can actually create up to 10,000 axons, 10,000 connections with other neurons. And that happens very individually, depending on your experiences, depending on what you want to do and what you decide to do. So your decisions and what you practice regularly, all that leaves material traces in your brain, which means that what you experience, your events, your thoughts, your mental qualia, what you experience, that leaves material traces. Spiritual experiences leave material traces in your brain. And it's like with a motor highway. when cars use a motor highway a lot, then the motor highway is reinforced and made even stronger. Not only 2 tracks, but 3 tracks and 4 tracks. When you don't use it, then you deconstruct it because you don't want to waste any energy.
There's a grass growing on
And so neuroscientists usually say what fires together, wires together. So when neurons work together, they are connected.
Okay, but here I have a question. We speak about the connections that develop in the brain.
Yeah.
But is this what makes us intelligent? Is when we measure IQ of certain people, what makes us smarter or less smart? I mean, in the scale of IQ, is it the amount of connections that we have in the brain, or is there something more to it?
That is very, very hard to tell. We even don't really know how to define intelligence. I mean, we can concentrate on very specific abilities, like maybe the ability to calculate numbers or something like that, and then we can measure IQ. And yes, it seems to be connected somehow to the number of connections that we have in certain areas of the brain, but to say that a person is more intelligent than another one and to calculate that from properties, material properties of your brain doesn't seem to be that easily calculable. For example, when you compare the number of neurons of a human brain and of an elephant brain, the elephant has many, many billions more neurons than human beings. But the elephant is not more intelligent than human beings, obviously.
Yeah, that would be my question. Does it mean they are more intelligent? And you say no. What is intelligence?
The only difference that we have is that the ratio between the weight of the brain in a human is about 2% of the body weight. In an elephant, it's less than 1%. So it seems that the ratio of the brain compared to the body weight is some indicator for intelligence, but of course it's a very weak indicator.
It might be coincidence.
It seems that intelligence is much more than just a quantitative property. And of course, if you have no connections, then there is no intelligence. But you can't say that, you cannot even count all the connections, of course. I mean, you would always have to recognize that we have about 1,000 billion connections in the brain. And if you would pull out all the connections from our brain and make a very long linear chain out of these connections, you would not only get from Gdansk to Moscow or to Beijing, no, you would get from here, from Earth, to the moon and back. It's 750,000 kilometers of connections in our brain. And that's just amazing. And to measure all that is just such a huge task. We cannot really fully map the whole state of our brain, especially as it's dynamic and it can change within hours, within days and so on. So it's a dynamic, organic object, the brain. Okay. It's not just a static thing that you are born with and then it never changes. We talk about neuroplasticity in the neurosciences. The brain adapts and changes, and what you use will be reinforced and what you don't use will be deconstructed. So if you practice playing the violin day by day, then the areas that have to do with controlling your fingers and listening and analyzing to sounds will be very much increased. While when you do mathematical calculations, then these areas will be increased. Okay. If you look pornography, then these areas will be increased and you will become more and more dependent on watching pornography and so on. So it's a thing that leads to the good and to the bad. And it's your decision what you want to do with your brain, actually.
Okay, here you have a question that is much more connected to the Bible stories at least. When I think about Jesus Christ, what was his brain like? Can you guess? Can we?
Wow, I would love to analyze Jesus' brain as well, yeah. But
was it normal?
The problem is that the body of Jesus disappeared, you know? He is resurrected, so we have no access to the brain anymore, unfortunately. And the people in those days had no chance to look into the skull because they don't have EEGs, they didn't have
James
MRTs.
Cameron claimed he found the bones of Jesus Christ.
Yeah, in the movie maybe, but obviously we don't have access. The tomb of Jesus is empty. That's unique about Jesus. Right. But I would say, as God became a human being, an incarnate human being, I think from outside it would probably look very much similar to a normal human brain, even though every human brain is unique. No brain is the same as another human brain.
Did Jesus learn? Was he learning?
Yes, the Bible several times talks about Jesus actually increased in bodily and increased spiritually and with his reason. So he needed to learn step by step. So the connections
from
increased.
His childhood, his brain was developing all the time.
Yeah, I think like a human being.
So what does it mean? He was less God than he was later, in the beginning, or it's different category?
I mean, that is a very good question. How can God, the all-knowing God, actually increase in knowledge? But if God really became a human being, then obviously he had to learn. As a little baby, he was not able to tell you the amount of stars in the Milky Way galaxy, while God the Father, of course, knew that. And we even have some indication in the Bible when the disciples of Jesus ask him, so when will God restore the kingdom on earth? When will he build his kingdom? And then Jesus says, it's not up to us to know the time, only the Father knows the time. Even the Son does not know, at least as long as the Son is living on earth. Yeah. So God is free to restrict his all-knowing power while he was a human being. But of course, when Jesus went back to the Father, I'm absolutely sure that they are in unbroken relationship. So Jesus now knows everything again with the Father. But of course, as long as he was a human being, he just cut himself off from some of the abilities, and he only did what the Father directly revealed to him. So the big difference is probably not a difference in brain, but a difference in spirit, that God had a very direct way of revealing to Jesus what he would go to do as the next step.
Okay, I have so many questions. One of them is, if you mentioned that we develop the connections in the brain by, for example, playing music or listening to the music or watching pornography.
Or orienting in space. For example, taxi drivers in London had to learn all the streets in London by heart. So they knew by heart that. And they had a much bigger developed cortex in the area of spatial orientation than bus drivers, because bus drivers always take the same route. And people compared it 25 years ago, and they found out that the region of the brain is much more developed in the taxi driver than in the bus driver, because they need to orient themselves all the time.
That's interesting. But here comes my question. The question is, if our brain is developed by non-materialistic activity, like playing music, listening music, driving a car, learning, and so on, what does it tell us about us?
That's a very good question, actually, and we should think about that. Because when we ask scientists, what can you measure about a human person? They can only measure electrical currents. But what makes us human beings is our experience. We experience these electrical currents as images. We experience them as words with a meaning, with semantics. Yeah, if my wife tells me I love you, on the physical level, this is just sound transmission and electrical currents in my brain. But my heart starts to beat faster, my blood pressure increases, and I want to hug my wife if she tells me, and the same the other way around when I talk to my wife. So there is something going on that has a material, a bodily consequence. But the words themselves are more than just sound waves. They transmit meaning, they transmit significance to me, and this cannot be reduced to material processes only. When my wife tells me I love you, then this is not identical with the hormone level in my body or with the blood pressure in my body, because I could produce that by myself using certain chemicals, and then I could still say I feel loved because of the chemicals and the drugs that I took. And some people try to substitute real love with drugs, but that does not work. That just leads you in bad dependence and so on. So I think it tells us that we are more than just material beings. We are actually living souls, as the Bible tells us, living souls that are, as I tend to say it, that are incarnate in the body. We are incarnated living souls. So our body is part of us, but our soul is more than the body. Our soul lives and inhabits our material body.
So are you saying that our brain is something, well, much more than a computer?
Yes, because a
computer can process lots of information. Seems like our brain too. And some people even say it's almost the same. We will just keep improving the computers, and they will be like humans.
Yes, some people say that, and we need to take a lot of things into account there. First of all, we need to take into account that, yes, artificial intelligence and neuronal networks, as the name says in artificial intelligence, they try to simulate parts of the functions of the brain. In the brain, we observe that neurons fire and pass on information through the firing, and so the computer simulates that. But the computer is much faster. The computer works in the realm of terahertz frequencies, while the brain only works in kilohertz frequencies. And still, the brain does a lot of things much better than the computer, because the brain does not work linearly as the computer does, but the brain can work with avalanches and parallel processing. Like several neurons pass on the signal at the same time, while the computer always passes on linearly. But still, the computer can do some things better because it's faster, and it works in a different way. So it's not the same, even though there are some similarities. And then we must admit that we simply don't know yet the whole way how the brain actually works, because the brain does not only work on electrical signals with the neurons, but there are other nerve cells. Recently, they have discovered again other nerve cells that somehow are connected to the neurons and seem to play an important part in passing on signals and so on. Then we have hormones that pass on signals, and we have avalanche mechanisms that multiply the signal and the amplitude and so on. And all these things are not yet in the processing capacities of computers. And then we need to take into account a computer always works on data, like you give some input of data, and then the computer processes according to the programmed algorithms that are contained in the computer, and then it produces output. Just to give you an example, you know, some computers are able to detect cat pictures, like on captchas in the internet. You have always to say, is that a cat or is it a dog, and so on. Tick all pictures that show a cat, for example. And then you do it and the computer learns. You train the computer. But the computer needs about thousands of cat and dog pictures to understand or to identify, understand is a wrong anthropomorphism actually, to detect correctly what a cat is and what a dog is. And it can still be deceived. When I taught my daughter at the age of about 2 years as a little child, I showed her one picture of a cat and said, this is a cat, and the cat says, meow, meow, and this is a dog, and says, wow, wow. One picture would be enough, and my daughter could distinguish between cat and dog. And I think every baby does it. Maybe 1 or 2 pictures are enough. Because they understand it. They understand the properties that make a cat and a dog intuitively. So human beings are able to intuitively understand by acquaintance, and they capture a semantic level that the machine simply cannot understand. The machine only works on the level of statistics, and maybe some syntactical rules, syntax and statistics, but the machine does not capture semantics. Semantics can only be simulated by a lot of statistics. And that's what happens in AI. When you do enough statistics...
I was going to ask you about AI. What about artificial intelligence? Is it a matter of time that we'll keep improving the computers, the connections between computers, and finally, one day, the computer will be conscious of its own existence? Do you think it's possible?
Well, there are 2 questions. First of all, I would say, yes, computers will increase in their power if you increase their memory and the way how they are programmed, of course. And we see that in the development of chatbots, for example. There is an increase, but it's only an increase in statistical progress. For example, when you train computers not only with humanly generated texts, but also with their own texts, they have found out that the ability of chatbots decreases again, and they produce a lot of rubbish because the little mistakes are multiplied when you train the computers with their own products. So the computers are dependent on intelligent human input so that they make sense with what they produce. So that's the one thing. a different question is the second question, and a very important question, the question of consciousness. Is consciousness just a function of data processing power? And there is a very interesting thought experiment about that. And that is the thought experiment of Frank Cameron Jackson. And we travel into the future, and we have a scientist called Mary. And Mary knows everything about color perception, but she has been born colorblind. So she knows all the physics, chemistry, biology, psychology, everything about color perception in the future that might be possible, complete scientific description, but she is not able to perceive colors. She only sees black, white, and gray scales. Okay. And then she undergoes surgery in the future that might be possible. They reconnect her brain, and suddenly she can perceive red and green and blue and appreciate the experience of seeing red. And the question is, did Mary learn a new thing? Is it something new when you can actually see and experience red, or is it enough to have a complete scientific description? And most philosophers agree, yes, she learned something new. But that would mean that consciousness is more than just a scientific description, a complete scientific description, and more than just data processing, input, processing, and output. Consciousness is actually something that we cannot fully describe by scientific terms. We can also say experiencing is more than studying. For example, when I say, I love your red shirt, and I see your shirt is red, then you can say, yes, my shirt is red. But whether we experience the same red color in our minds, in our feelings, we just don't know. We can use the same word, but I cannot even know whether you have the same experience that I have.
Yeah, I know what I experience, but I don't know what you experience.
Only by analogy, you can assume that I make the same experience, but maybe what I experience about your shirt is what you would call blue. Maybe my brain is wired in a completely different way, and my mind experienced something else. We never will know. And that's Thomas Nagel, a famous New York philosopher. He wrote in the 80s an article, what it feels like to be a bat. Like bats don't use visual perception. They
bats, you mean the car?
No, bat. I mean the flying animals, the flying mammals, actually. And they don't use visual perception, but they use echo, sound waves, in order to reconstruct the environment. And he says, while we can understand how they use echolocation and echolocomotion and so on, we never will know how they perceive the world around them. And by principle we cannot, because the experience, the personal experience, is only accessible to me, to myself, to the personal, to the individual. And that's valid for all animals, and it's valid for all human beings. And no third person perception, no scientific experiment has actually access to what I think. I can train EEGs to a certain patient, to a certain person, and then I can maybe connect certain activity images of electrical currents or magnetic fields in the brain to a certain thought. But it takes a lot of training in order to connect that together. But we cannot know actually what a person is thinking for real. If the person tells us, actually, I'm thinking about something, but the person thinks about something else, then we will be mistaken about it. Because we don't see the image and we don't hear the sound of a person.
Yeah. When you said about training computer, I was thinking, once I saw the picture of, it was called Chinese room.
Yeah.
And I think it helps a lot to understand what's the difference between computer and the human brain. Would you explain it?
Yeah, that's an illustration by the philosopher John Searle that he made about computers, whether computers are intelligent. And his claim is, no, computers are not intelligent at all. And he uses a very good analogy. He says, imagine a black box room. And in this black box room, from outside, no one knows what happens inside. But inside, there is a person, maybe someone from Gdansk, and they have no idea about Chinese language. They can't read Chinese, but of course they can see the structure of the letter. And so Chinese people enter letters with a Chinese question, and then person from Gdansk in the black box room looks at the structure of the letters, and because they have a good Chinese friend who's very wise, this Chinese friend gave them kind of an encyclopedia in which the friend says, if you see these signs, respond with those signs. So it's a look-up table for how to respond to certain words and to certain pictures or certain structures of letters, even though you can't even read the words in Chinese. And so they respond with certain scratches and so on. They put the letter to the outside again, and the Chinese person on the outside says, wow, that's a really good response to my question. But the point is, the person inside the black box has no idea about the semantics. It only follows rules that were created by an intelligent human being, by that wise Chinese man. And John Searle says that's exactly the way how a computer works. The computer works on the rules, on the algorithms that were programmed by an intelligent human being. If something happens, then do the following. That's the way how a computer works usually. And now, of course, we come into the realm of artificial intelligence, and people say, well, but artificial intelligence doesn't seem to have if-then rules, but it seems to be more complex. And so, yes, artificial intelligence is programmed a bit differently. Artificial intelligence does not get a complete encyclopedia, a complete book of rules, but it starts with a rather empty book. And so it is trained with questions and answers. So a question is given to the artificial intelligence. The artificial intelligence gives any output, and then the programmer tells the machine this is a good output or this is a bad output. And depending on the response, the machine will increase the pathway how the information was processed or will change it if it's a bad output. And that way, if you do that thousands of times or millions of times or billions of times, if you train a chatbot, you need to do that billions of times, for example, with billions of texts. Then step by step, through statistics, the machine will learn, so to say, but it doesn't really learn by insight, but just by statistical input, to produce meaningful text. And again, it just follows rules, even though this time in artificial intelligence, the rules are not fixed, like with an encyclopedia, when you have, if A happens, do B. But in this case, it creates its own rules, based on learning on practical examples that were trained by an intelligent teacher.
So can we say that the computer have no idea what it's doing?
I would say so.
Because it seems to me that when I experience something, let's say it's a voice of my wife speaking to me. It comes through my ear and becomes an electromagnetic or whatever. A signal comes to my brain, and I make sense of it.
Exactly.
And the computer, it seems to me that it doesn't make any sense. It just knows how to respond to this kind of signal, how to connect with other signals and come with an outcome.
Yeah. I mean, let's just take an example. When, for example, we pass on the information, I love you, to a computer. The computer does not know what to do with that. He just gets the signals and he can pass on the signals. And now I can train the computer. If someone tells you, I love you, let's talk about a robot maybe, an androidic robot that looks like a human being. If someone tells that computer, I love you, the computer is trained to kiss that person, for example. So from the outside, it looks like, oh, the computer hears I love you and then reacts in an appropriate way and kisses you and says, I love you too, baby, or something like that. But that's just a simulation of human behavior that was trained into the computer. But when we take a human being, we have the signal transmission via electrical currents in the brain and so on, so the data are processed. But these signals actually cause some kind of semantics in us. We understand that there is another person that tells us, you really mean something to me. You are important to me. I have a personal affection to me. So we understand something. So we get knowledge. A computer does not really gain knowledge. A computer just gains data processing power. And simulation of how to process data. So human beings have data processing power. They also have knowledge. And then, in addition to knowledge, we also have wisdom, which means how can we apply that knowledge in an appropriate way? If someone tells me, I love you, the wisdom is, first of all, does he mean that in reality, or does he want to cheat me, just get my money, for example? That's wisdom. And then if I really am sure that someone loves me, I can trust that person. So I can do something with that person, which I only can do with that person because of love. So there is wisdom to it, which a machine also does not really have. And we have the experience of feelings, that I feel I'm at home with that person. And a computer does not have these feelings. Of course, to be honest, we don't know that for sure, because we don't even know whether an animal has feelings or not. We just have indications for that. We don't know whether other human beings have feelings or are just zombies. But the difference is, we know how a human being develops. It's an organic living being. And we know how a computer is generated. It's just constructed from circuits. So it's just a machine that has the capacity to process data. But there is no life in the computer. There is no spirit in the computer. And even though the computer can actually simulate data processing, the computer does not experience things. If you ask a computer, why do you do what you do? The computer usually cannot give you an answer unless you train the computer to give an answer again. So you have to teach the computer always to simulate human behavior. But the computer does not ask questions themselves. ChatGPT, for example, does not do anything unless you ask, can you explain to me what the human brain is? And then ChatGPT will give you an answer. So it always reacts to external stimuli, but it does not have intentions. It does not say, well, actually, I long to live eternally, so I need to do something about that, and so on. But human beings, we ask for the meaning of life, in life. We ask for what is good, what is bad. We want to have answers to our questions, and we have questions and longings in us. The computer is just there and only will react to our initiative.
And that's something that causes some other questions.
Yeah.
If computer or the artificial intelligence requires training, and we are the ones who are training them, it shows that there is a huge difference between us and the computer. It means we are like gods to the computer. We program it. But the next question is, if our relationship with the computer is like God and human, does it mean God is programming us to behave a certain way? Do we have a free will?
Yeah, I mean, these are many, many big questions. Thank you. Well, first of all, definitely it poses difficult questions for us when we realize we as human beings have the longing to create something that is made in our image. And it seems that this could be a reflection of what God did with us, because he created us in his image. But the interesting thing is that when we try to create something in our image, it is simply a machine that can process data and can imitate our behavior. But when God created us in his image, he can create life from non-life. So it's a big question, what is actually life? What makes a dead cell a living cell? If you compare a dead cell to a living cell, there is not much difference chemically. The only thing is one system is dynamic and working, and the other system is not dynamic and working, and hence is simply decaying and perishing, while the other system is working. But what is it that gives the spark of life to one structure, to one chemical structure, and to the other chemical structure? What life exactly is, we don't know. We can only describe the effects that life reproduces, that life metabolizes, that life stores information in the DNA and so on. So these are all effects and functions of life, but they are not life itself. So we don't know what life actually is. So that's a big question. And we can only say that life is different from non-life and different from machines. And then the next difficult question is, what is consciousness? And what distinguishes a living cell from a conscious living being? It seems that unicellular life, like bacteria, are not conscious. They just follow physical stimuli.
So they are like computers.
They are a bit like computers, but it seems they are even more than computers. They are not just computers, but there are more similarities. But as soon as you go into the animal kingdom, for example, even to insects or to worms and so on, for example, there is a worm that has 309 nerve cells, and you can describe completely how they react to external stimuli. But we don't know, and we will never know whether this worm actually experiences reality and has a concept or a picture of the world around it itself, or whether it just doesn't have consciousness and works like a machine. We just don't know, because we don't know what life is and we don't know what consciousness is. So these are big questions, and it seems that science hits a very strong limit here, like the philosopher David Chalmers. He actually made a big bet with Christoph Koch 25 years ago, when he said neuroscience will not understand and solve the mystery, the hard problem of consciousness, that they can have a working model of what consciousness is. They can explain correlations, what happens when we have conscious experience in the brain, but we cannot explain what consciousness is on a neurological scale, because he says consciousness is different. It's orthogonal to it. And he won the bet. Last year, Christoph Koch, who said, well, we will have a complete solution to that question, he had to pay several boxes of very valuable wine, precious wine, to David Chalmers. But he said, let's continue the bet for the next years. So he still is optimistic to solve the puzzle, but David Chalmers is very sure that the question will not be solved, because as we saw with the colorblind scientist Mary, consciousness doesn't seem to be reducible to scientific terms and to data processing power.
So you seems to be convinced that we are more than a brain.
Yeah, we are more than material beings. We are material, but we are more than that. Yeah.
We store our memories somewhere in the brain, but what happens when we die? All the memories are gone. All the moral decisions that we make are gone, because the place in the brain that stored everything we did in our life is gone. It's empty, it's erased. Nobody will judge us.
Yeah, I mean, here the question becomes very, very existential for us personally, because either our existence finishes ultimately and we will never come back, because there's no possibility to bring back physical life if life is only material and physically, because our body decays. And even if we can restore somehow the memories on a hard drive or something, as some science fiction movies seem to indicate, there is no security that we as persons would come back, because it's just a copy of our data, of our memories. And if I could clone myself into an identical physical clone of myself, there is no guarantee that that is the same person. It could be a very different person with very similar memories, but with a different consciousness.
I saw a movie where they were copying the content of your brain, and it was the same movie, the same person.
Okay, so, well, there is no guarantee for that. It could be a very different...
It was a movie.
For example, in Avatar 2, the evil guy who dies in Avatar 1 comes back in a different body, but even though the avatar behaves in a similar way to that evil guy, the avatar itself has questions. Am I the same person, or am I just similar to that person? So even the person itself doesn't seem to know in that science fiction movie. But that's one thing. The big question is my conscious experience bound and completely determined by my material state? And I would say there are two arguments that need to be taken into account. One argument is a philosophical argument, and that is my mental experience completely determined by material states? And a good analogy is a TV. If I watch a TV movie and I'm sick of watching that movie and I want to stop it because it's a waste of time, and I destroy my TV, have I destroyed the movie and the TV program by destroying my TV? No, the movie is still around. It could be watched on another TV or on another receiver. I've only destroyed the receiver because the electrical circuits in my TV, they do not produce the movie. They do not produce the mental phenomena. They only transmit them in a material way, transforming them into an image. And I think that's a good analogy for my conscious experience, that my brain transmits my experiences into this material world, but the brain currents and the brain circuits are not necessarily identical with my mental experiences, with my thoughts and so on. It's just the other way around. I can change the physical state of your brain by just asking you, what is 13 times 17? When you now start to calculate, then I have changed the physical status, the physical state of your brain, actually. So ideas, no matter whether I transmit them acoustically or optically, I could show you on a screen without saying anything, or you could think for yourself about what do I want to calculate, and then the idea itself changes the physical state. So ideas can change the physical state. Feelings can change the physical state when you fall in love.
Wait a minute, but because it sounds like usually when we think about the brain and what happens in our imagination, let's say, we tend to think that it's caused by the brain, and now you are saying it works also the other way.
It works also the other way, top down.
Stimulating the brain causes us to think about something, but thinking about something causes changes in the brain.
Exactly. It is our experience, actually, especially in medicine, we know about that. It's called psychosomatic interaction. You know, when there could be a completely healthy person, and then the person is in love with a partner, and then one day, from 1 second to the other, the partner says, our relationship is finished. I have found someone better than you. I am gone. Goodbye. And this completely healthy person, because of that experience, suddenly becomes sick, has hurtings in the stomach, the dopamine level changes, the hormone level changes, the person becomes depressed and so on. So the whole body changes because of a mental phenomenon, actually, a non-physical phenomenon that shows that our soul has an enormous effect on our body. And the other way around is valid too. If I drink too much alcohol, I'm not able to calculate 13 times 17 anymore. So we have both ways interactions. Our soul is impacted by our material state of the body, and our material state of the body is impacted by our soul. But that shows that it might be possible that when our body dies, then our soul lives on. Like Jesus says in the Gospels, for example, in Matthew 10, he says that we should not be afraid, Matthew 10 verse 28, we should not be afraid of those who can kill the body, but we should only be afraid of the one who can kill the body and the soul in the hell. So human beings are only able to kill the body, but the soul seems to live on. There are many other indicators in the Bible that our conscious experience, our soul, our myself, my person, can actually survive the death of the body. And that is now the second argument. It's an empirical argument, and that's the argument from near-death experience. We have thousands of near-death experiences that have been scientifically reported by doctors.
Coma, right?
Yeah, like coma patients, for example. I mean, coma is not necessarily near-death, but near-death means really people are about to die, and there is no brain activity that can be measured. With coma patients, the interesting thing is often you can even measure brain activity, but they cannot do anything with it anymore. But there have been great experiments that by training the EEG signal of the coma patient, they can still communicate with people by choosing numbers and choosing letters and so on. And they can thank the doctors and the family without being able to move the body in any way. They can still think about, for example, moving my right arm. And then the doctors say, if you want to say yes to our question, then think about moving your right arm.
Just think
about it.
Because he cannot move it.
And because of the EEG, they can record the activity pattern, and you can calibrate the activity pattern by asking easy questions like, what is 1 + 1? Is 1 + 1 2? And if the coma patient thinks yes, and I want to move my right arm, then they can calibrate the signal and know when the patient wants to answer with yes. On the other hand, when the patient wants to answer with no, then the patient should think about something else. And so you can calibrate the system on that. And that way, the patients can choose between different letters and they can write sentences on certain devices that are connected to the EEG signal and so on. And so there's a very interesting incident where a coma patient in the University Hospital of Tübingen communicated with the doctors and thanked them and told them that he would love to have some goulash soup on the tongue because he misses...
While being in coma.
Yeah, while being in coma. He missed the experience of tasting a nice goulash soup, for example. Of course, it took hours for him to communicate that phrase on the screen, on the computer screen, but it was possible for him to do that. And that was amazing, actually, that it works. It does not necessarily work with all coma patients because they can be very different in the state, but it shows that often coma patients still have brain activity and they perceive everything around them, but they cannot react to that anymore, which is very important for us as human beings when we interact with coma patients. We always should be aware they could still perceive everything we say and we do. So we should touch them. They could perceive the touch and feel the love that we show to them. That's so important. When you are a near-death patient,
that's the other case.
Then usually the signal, the EEG signal, is 0, and you can't measure an EEG signal anymore. But interestingly, when you resuscitate near-death experiencers and they become conscious again, there are quite a few of them. There have been even experiments like in the AWARE project in an English university, the AWARE project by Sam Parnia. And they report that there have been verifiable conscious phases, even though it seems that the patient himself was unconscious and dead, but bodily. But they report of experiences that are somehow verifiable. And of course, it's on the border of mysticism somehow. If such a person reports, well, I left my body, I saw what you did, I saw that some of you took my glasses and put it in a cupboard, for example, in the drawer, in the second drawer on the left-hand side, for example, and that was true. Or I even left the room and I was above the hospital and I saw that on the rooftop of the hospital there is a red tennis shoe with the laces put inside the tennis shoe. And then the doctor and medical personnel, medical staff, they say, well, okay, let's check on that and let's actually go to the top of the roof. And they searched everything and in the end they found such a tennis shoe, that there is this tennis shoe. Wow. Or they even report about a car accident that would happen next to the hospital and say, well, 2 people died in the car accident and 2 people survived. And when they checked on the accident, that really happened that way.
And these are stories told by people who had 0 brain activity.
I have not experienced that, but as far as I have read about that, yes, this is reported in scientific papers that you can read in the magazines on near-death experiences. And of course, there are 2 possibilities. Either their experience is real, or there is a conspiracy between the doctor and the patient to become famous, and so they actually cheated. Right. And the doctor and the patient said, okay, there happened, a car accident happened, and you can actually tell that story, and then you will have a great near-death experience. We, of course, will never be absolutely sure that this was not the case. That's the problem about near-death experiences. They are not scientifically verifiable. But as there are so many of them, I think it's unlikely that all of them are frauds, especially as some of them really led people to change their complete worldview. Like there is a very famous case of a neuroscientist in America, Ibn Alexander. He was a materialist and then he fell into coma because of a virus in his brain, meningitis virus, and he nearly died. And during that time, he had a near-death experience, and he said, I think I was in heaven. And so he started to believe that the soul lives on because of that experience. That was so real to him that he said, this cannot just be imagination or an illusion. It was real. It felt real to me. And there are people who have changed the whole worldview, like him. Some became Christians, others became esoterics, and so on. So the experience themselves do not prove that a religion is true. but they show that it seems something is going on beyond death with our conscious experience, and that conscious experience actually goes on after death. There are philosophers who have studied a lot of the evidence. For example, the American philosopher Gary Habermas and J.P. Moreland, they have written a book called Beyond Death. And there they analyze a lot of these experiences and show that they fall into different categories. And they say the strongest arguments for continuous consciousness after death are the so-called evidence-based near-death experiences. Like when someone reports about events that can be verified, that really happened. Some also report on what their relatives did, and that can be very embarrassing for people. Like they report one case where the relatives of of a person who had to be resuscitated, they said, whatever happens inside there, we hope it happens fast. Like, if the person is to die, please let that person die soon, or something like that. And the person inside the room was removed, and there were walls between that, so the person had no chance of hearing that. But when the person came back to life, and the relatives were allowed to come in, then the patient confronted the relative who said that and said, "What exactly did you mean by whatever happens inside the room? I hope it happens fast." And the person was like, "I'm sorry. I hoped you would survive, of course," but it was very embarrassing. So always pay attention to what you say about a person who is about to die, maybe, but maybe will not die, because they might still perceive it. It's a strange... I mean, in Jewish theology, people believe that the soul of a human body remains with the body about 3 days. And only on the fourth day, the soul, or on the third day, the soul actually leaves the body. That is why Jesus, for example, waits 4 days until he comes back to his friend Lazarus, who has died, and the sister Martha and Mary, they ask Jesus, "Please come and help us, he's sick and he will die." And Jesus only comes back on the fourth day, and then he resurrects him, because then the Jewish people were sure this guy really was dead and the soul has left him already.
I remember this was always puzzling me. I was reading the text, and it says that, and that when Jesus heard about this Lazarus being sick, he waited.
Yeah.
And he seems to do it purposefully, so it would explain why he
It has to do with
long.
Jewish tradition, that they believed the soul is still present for 3 days, and so it could still connect to the body maybe within 3 days, but when 3 days are completed, the soul has gone. It is with God, so or in the place where the souls go afterwards,
really
dead, and can't come back to life. And Jesus comes and he resurrects Lazarus. Of course, Lazarus died later again. It's different from the resurrection of Jesus himself later. But it's already a sign that Jesus has the power to make dead people alive again. And of course, if that is true, that will change our whole personal perception of who we are. We are not just material beings, but we are living souls that are actually created for eternity, that are created with a longing to spend eternity with the God who created us eternally and who loves us with all his heart and wants to spend eternity with him, and who wants us to have a personal relationship with him.
Okay, we're coming to the close of our conversation. Let's try to summarize it. Let's try to do it this way. What personally for you is the most convincing arguments that we are more than a brain? In summary.
In summary, well, I would say when my personal experience cannot be reduced to material processes. Science always can only describe the electrical currents and the magnetic fields in our brain and the structures in the brain, but we do not see the images, we do not hear the sounds. So my experience is something that cannot be described and grasped completely by scientific experiments. And then, of course, that there are these kinds of experiences that are beyond material explanation, like near-death experiences and so on. But personally, the most convincing thing for me is the resurrection of Jesus, I must admit. Because I think what happened 2,000 years ago to Jesus Christ, This is for me the turning point in history. If Jesus Christ did not remain in the grave, in the tomb, but was resurrected, that for me changes everything.
Yeah, but some people can say it's just a story. Different religions have their own stories.
Of course.
What do you say?
And we could probably go on for another 60 minutes that there are historical evidences that explain why there are historical arguments why Jesus was resurrected from the dead. For example, we can know for sure that the tomb must have been empty. The body must have gone away. If the body had been there and the Christians go out to all the people in Jerusalem and tell them, you know, we believe in Jesus because he was resurrected from the dead. And then the Romans and Jewish people who hated that message and wanted to destroy the Christians, it would have been very easy for them to say, come to the tomb, we know where we put him. Pilate knows the tomb where Joseph of Arimathea put him, and he even put soldiers there to take care of the body so that no one could steal it, as the Gospels report. So they knew where it was. And so if the dead body would still be there and around, and the Romans and Jewish could always point to that, and the whole mystery would be debunked. No one would believe it because people would say they are crazy liars. But the body was not there, so the tomb was empty. So who could have taken that away? I think grave robbers could have earned a lot of money with that body. They could have brought that body back to the Romans. And by the way, they would have no reason to steal the body because Jesus was not a rich person. So there was no reason to steal the body. And even the linen, which was the most precious thing, was left in the tomb. Yeah, John and Peter find the linen, and Peter says, wow, because of the way how the linen lies there, I believe. So it seems it was not robbers. So the only group who could be responsible for stealing the body would be the disciples. But if the disciples stole the body, then of course they should make up a story that is very plausible for the people around them. But what do all four Gospels tell us? All four Gospels tell us that women were the first witnesses to the empty tomb, and women were the first to see the risen Jesus. But in those days, when someone would say, you know, I believe that Jesus was risen from the dead, and I believe it because the woman told us, all the people would just laugh at them. Because in Jewish law and in Roman law, the witness of women would not be accepted as a reliable witness. These were very strict laws. Only male persons would be accepted in front of a judge in a court case, and it should be two male witnesses actually in Jewish law. Only then would the testimony be accepted, otherwise not. So if you create a story and make it as plausible as possible, you would never choose that women were the first witnesses. And then of course Jesus appeared to disciples who did not expect that. In all cases when Jesus appeared to the woman, to the disciples, they would not believe it. For example, Mary Magdalene, she mistakes Jesus for the gardener. And only at the very end, when Jesus calls her by name, she realizes, oh, you are not the gardener, you are my rabbi, you are my teacher, you are Jesus. And then she wants to touch him, but he says, don't touch me, the time has not yet come for you to have close relationship with me. And then Jesus appears to the disciples. The disciples did not believe the woman who told about Jesus and the empty tomb and so on. So John and Peter went to the empty tomb, and they checked for themselves the evidence, and then they believed, at least John believed. And then Jesus appeared to the 10 disciples, but Thomas was not among them. They tell Thomas. Thomas did not believe and says, I will only believe if Jesus appears to me. So they were very skeptical. They needed arguments and needed real experiences in order to believe. And only after 50 days, they started to become courageous people who would go out and proclaim that news and even risk their own lives. And so the big question is, what happened to these anxious disciples that changed their whole life? And it was obviously not a power play, because after they proclaimed that new message, they were persecuted. They were driven out of the synagogue, of their usual relationships and context. They had to leave Jerusalem even. So they did not have any political power from that. Then they took care of the poor people. So when they got money, they spent the money, and the Jerusalem church soon became very poor. Paul had to raise money for the Jerusalem church. So it was also not a material advantage that they had. They had no material, no political advantage. They became poor, they became powerless. but they had a fulfilled life, a life following Jesus, and they had meaning in their life because they knew what they did was pleasing to God. And it was based on the evidence that the dead crucified Jesus, and they all saw that Jesus was crucified. So they knew how Jesus died, how the Roman soldier put the spear in the side of Jesus, and blood came out of that. And so he died, and they didn't believe that he could become alive again. But he did, and they were persuaded by that, and that changed their life. So I think that's the best explanation, and all other explanations that the disciples actually were liars and they had a conspiracy, I think that would fall short, because if you are in front of the emperor and he says, either you stop believing in Jesus or I will kill you, I think you will certainly make the decision that you really believe. And if you are a liar and you believe in a lie, you will not say, well, I cannot stop believing in Jesus because he gives eternal life to me, if you know that the dead body is still around there and Jesus has not really been resurrected. You can only do that. And as far as we know, everyone apart from John, every one of the first apostles died a martyr's death actually. Only John, he was exiled to the Isle of Patmos, also very bad place to be in those days. Only he, but all of them remained faithful to what they proclaimed.
Okay, wow, that's a lot.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, we should finish our conversation, but we promise that we'll give a question at the end, and those who are answering properly and those who are first ones will receive a copy of this movie. What question would we ask?
I think an interesting question might be, what do you believe if we take all the connections in our brain out of our brain and we create a chain from here to somewhere else? How long would that chain be? Do you remember how long that is?
Okay, czyli mamy pytanie na koniec naszego programu. Jak długie byłoby połączenie tych wszystkich, how did you call it?
The connections, the axons, actually the scientific axons, if you take out all the connections between the
aksonów,
100 billion neurons, 86 billion neurons in our brain, if you take the connections out in a long linear chain.
Tak, jeżeli połączymy je w jedną linię, jak długi odcinek powstanie z tego. Była o tym mowa w odcinku, kto pamięta, bardzo prosimy, zapiszcie. Możecie dodać oczywiście ocenę swoją, komentarz i zachęcamy bardzo serdecznie do tego, żeby udostępniać, lajkować, jeżeli tego nie zrobiliście. No i koniecznie subskrybować nasz materiał, który staramy się tworzyć najlepiej jak potrafimy. Mam nadzieję, że jest to dla was wszystkich błogosławieństwem i czymś naprawdę ciekawym, inspirującym. Alexander, thank you very much for this conversation, for this long conversation, but we covered a lot of materials.
Dziękuję for the great discussion. I enjoyed it very much. And do svidania. I wish God's blessing to all of you.
Do svidania is Russian.
Oh, sorry.
Do widzenia.
What a bad thing at the end. Okay.
Dobra, przepraszamy za to zakończenie.
What's the Polish word of saying goodbye?
Dziękujemy za waszą uwagę. Do zobaczenia w następnym odcinku.
I'm traveling too much. I'm sorry.